Hello, my name is Chris Smiley. I'm an alcoholic and drug addict. Thanks to the 12 steps, good sponsorships, and rooms like these with like-minded people, and most importantly, God, I've been sober since August 4th, 2020. And for that, I'm truly grateful. I say that in order to convey that I could not get sober alone. It was a process, something that had to be done with the help of others, and most importantly, it took a willingness on my behalf to be honest and allow God to come into my life and change it. I grew up the youngest of three boys in Bristol, Tennessee, and Virginia. Now it's on the state line deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. My parents were married over 50 years and remained that way up until my father's passing in 2021. There's a significant age gap between my brothers and I. My oldest brother, Kenneth, is 13 years older than me, and my middle brother, Grant, is 10. I was the baby. Both of my brothers remind me that all the time, that I got away with way more than they ever dreamed of. From a very young age, I always felt just different. I would later hear it called terminal uniqueness. I could walk into a room and see a group of kids and immediately feel like they were talking about me. Now, growing up for me was overall a good experience. I was fortunate enough to never experience any real childhood trauma. I was raised in a middle-class home, had two loving parents. They tried to give me everything that I asked for that was within reason. I was popular. I was involved in many sports, but yet I still always felt different. Every summer, my family spent most of our time on our lake house. Now, time was filled with good family fun, fishing, skiing, wakeboarding. Probably about 11 or 12 years old when I found that if I take some of my dad's moonshine or steal a couple of his Bud Lights, that feeling of inadequacy or feeling different, it went away. I immediately liked that feeling. Drinking around my family was very common. By high school, I convinced my parents to allow me to drink in their presence or in the presence of other responsible parents. Now, at this time, I had experienced zero negative consequences from my drinking. During high school, I started to smoke marijuana, started to binge drink at parties every weekend. At age 16, I remember trying hard drugs for the first time. Me and two of my friends were going to see a movie at the brand new movie theater. So we went over to this guy's trailer that we usually bought weed from. Dookie Stain Wayne. He lived on Hillbilly Lane. Now, Dookie Stain, when we got there, old Dookie Stain didn't have any weed. But what he did have was purple gel tab acid. And being the dumb kids like we were, we took it. We went and watched What Dreams May Come with Robin Williams, which is a trippy enough movie without being on acid. Now, after the movie, I went home. I stayed up all night long and went to school the next day. I even played in a basketball game that night. See, even early on, that's just how my using went. I could do them, I could maintain, and I never saw any negative consequences. They worked. They got me out of myself. Then life went on like this for a couple years. I experimented with all kinds of drugs, and I can see that this is when my life started to become unmanageable. I dropped out of college. My drinking and drugging became way more important to me. At the age of 21 is when my experimental phase ended. This is when I found Oxycontin. I thought that's when I truly had arrived. It's when I thought I truly arrived. I snorted the first one, and I vividly remember thinking this was the answer to all my problems. I wanted to feel like that all the time. And for the next couple of years, I tried to accomplish that. Things got worse very quickly. I no longer just snorted them. I started to use them via IV. At the time, I was so scared to share needles that I used that feeling to justify stealing my father's insulin syringes. I couldn't keep a job. My job at the time was to travel to Florida twice a week to see the pain doctor. Me and a bunch of 20-year-old kids going nowhere. The parking lots of these doctors were a sign of the epidemic going on in the Appalachian Mountains. All the cars were from out of state. Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Kentucky. It was around this time that I found out how bad a shape I was in. My drinking friends didn't want to hang out with me no more because they thought I did too many drugs. And my drug-using friends thought that I drank too much. It was about this time that I went into rehab for the first time. It was also the first time that I was introduced to the 12 steps. I did a 30-day stint, got cleaned up, and I went home. I went to a couple meetings back in Bristol in an old church basement. Now, meetings in a small town were few and far between, and I was very close-minded. Needless to say, without the willingness to change, I went back to the same old things and the same old friends that I was hanging out with before. For the next year, things got worse. I was not only using opiates daily, but I started to use and sell cocaine and crack to support my habit. One night, a guy that I was ripping and running with got into a car chase with the police. He got cornered in on a dead-end road and got out of the car and pointed a gun at the cops. Needless to say, it was suicide by cop. It's then when I knew something had to change. For all my times coming down to Florida, I'd heard about the rehabs down here. I found one that accepted my insurance, and I was gone the next day. This time, it was the first time that I was 100% willing to do something different. I didn't want to die, and I didn't want to go to jail. I took all the suggestions. I did 90 days at the Watershed Treatment Center. I then moved into a halfway house where I stayed for a year. I was surprised to find such a good recovery community down in Delray Beach. I got involved. I was hanging around people with my age that were on fire with recovery. I met a guy and I worked the 12 steps. I gained a surface level relationship with God. I prayed, I sponsored guys, and I took them through the steps. I was happy, but I now know that I didn't have the faith in God for everything in my life that I have today. After being down here a couple years and really flourishing and getting my life together, I met my ex-wife through the program. After dating for around 9 months, she became pregnant with my oldest son, Colton. Me being the stand-up guy I was, 1 week later I asked her to marry me. She didn't want to raise a family in South Florida. She says we're moving to Iowa. Now, against the advice of everyone in my support group, my sponsor, my family, I pick up and I move to Iowa. Now, this should have been the time where I continue with the program, where I throw myself into meetings. When I get there, I didn't. I quit going to meetings. I quit helping others. Most of all, I quit praying. I quit talking to and relying on God. My life didn't crumble immediately, other than being in a marriage that I wasn't happy in. Things were good. I was excelling in other areas. I took over her father's concrete pumping company. I did very well at taking over that company that was not doing so well and made it a profitable company. But without the program, and most of all, no spiritual solution to my addiction, I talked myself into believing that I wasn't an addict anymore. One day at home, with people knew about my past, they suggested that if I wanted to take the edge off, to try to smoke some weed with them. At that time, they urged me to stay away from the hard drugs. I had no defense. Once I started smoking and drinking again, it wasn't shortly after I found myself in downtown Des Moines on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, asking random people for heroin and needles. This became my dirty little secret for over a year. I used alone. I used with no one. Work was still going good, and we were more successful than others. But my home life was not. She knew something about me had changed, but didn't know exactly what was going on. When my ex-wife became pregnant with our youngest son, Camden, things began to really change. My disease had progressed so much that I could no longer hide it. No one knew how far I went down, but it was in the open that I had relapsed. I went to a doctor, not back to church, not back to AA. I was prescribed Suboxone and Adderall for my ADHD. I immediately started to abuse them as well as crystal meth. I could not stop. 1 week after the birth of my son, Camden, my father-in-law fired me for my drug use. Even though many people in the industry knew the reason I was fired, I was still able to convince another to hire me because I was so good at my job. They offered me a sign-on bonus and to pay my move back to run a branch in Johnson City, Tennessee. 3 weeks later, that same company that paid all the money to move me fired me for my drug use. I just kept using and trying to hide it from everyone around me. My ex-wife took off in the middle of the night with my 3-month-old and my 4-year-old son. This is when things really got bad for me. I was hopeless and I was alone. I moved back to my parents' lake house. I had no will to live, only to use. I overdosed 5 times over the course of 6 months. I watched my family shed countless tears begging me to stop. Those parents that I mentioned earlier that were married over 50 years started looking into divorce. I was causing chaos all around me. My dad always told me from a very young age, you are who you hang out with. To support my habit, I started to hang out with a very rough crowd. It was a dark time. I was using, selling, stealing, doing whatever I could just to get by. I was going through a divorce, and I had very little contact with my 2 boys, and I was living a lifestyle that would not end up well. After being back in Bristol for 6 months, I was arrested by the DEA, along with 36 other people and charged with the conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine. The new people I was hanging out with were being watched by the feds way before I ever came around. Now, don't get me wrong, I was into my fair share to support my addiction. I was not caught with selling, I was not caught with any drugs, but I was not the smartest drug addict. The electronic evidence and all the other evidence gathered from the others that were charged with, I was facing a lot of time behind bars. I was devastated. I thought my life was over. Mentally, I was a wreck, but I wasn't nearly as sick as I should have been. Getting arrested was one of the best things that ever happened to me. It's when God really started showing up and talking to me. Maybe it's when I finally started listening. June 19th, 2017, in Bristol City Jail, I got saved and recommitted my life to Jesus. I made the decision from that day forward that I would start living for the Lord. I made the decision to not be one of those guys who gets jailhouse religion, finds him on the inside, and then leaves him there when he leaves. That didn't make all my problems going away. I was still sentenced to 87 months in federal prison, and it sucked, all of it. It was violent, it was shady, it was dark, it was miserable. But I had God, and I had hope, and I had faith. I only spoke to my kids 3 times while I was locked up, and that was very hard for me, but I never lost the faith. I was in no way a perfect human while I was in the inside, but I did my best to keep my nose clean and stay out of the way. I took every single course that was offered to me in an attempt to kill time and to better myself. The most important thing that I did was build an amazing relationship with God. I used the time to pray and to meditate. I used my time to get into His Word. I used my time to listen and be still. Did my best to be a positive example of Jesus' love to everyone I came across. I worked my steps while I was on the inside via correspondence with a man in Arizona. I shared my 5th step with the prison chaplain. That same prison chaplain baptized me in the chapel as soon as the COVID restrictions were lifted in December of 2021. Now, my father passed away while I was on the inside. That man was my number one advocate. He was a great role model. He showed me unconditional love and never missed an opportunity to tell me how proud he was of me for changing my life while I was on the inside. Since I never got to say a proper goodbye, I was mad at God for a short period of time afterwards. But ultimately, His death strengthened me, and my faith grew stronger, which solidified my goal, which was to get out and live for Jesus. About a year after my dad's passing, my mom gave me some of the best news. She knew that I'd thrived in Florida and ultimately planned on coming back down here upon my release. She told me that she had been looking at a place in Lake Worth, and I would have a place to come back down to. This is when God showed up. All those classes that I'd been taking to kill time and better myself, well, it turns out they were called evidence-based recidivism reducing, and I was one of the first inmates to receive time off my sentence due to the First Step Act that Trump passed in 2018. I had 14 months taken off my sentence, and I was getting out in 6 months. That last 6 months were the worst and the longest of all my time. But what I did is I took that time to make a plan. I set some goals, and then I put it into God's hands. The plans I made, the goals I'd set, the 1 month, the 1 year, and probably even the 5 year goals that I had made, well, so far they were too small for God. I walked out of prison with my head held high. Changed man, January 3rd, 2023. I hated that it took prison, but it takes what it takes. I was scared, but I had faith. I had a plan. I was going to be honest. I wasn't going to run from my past. I was going to use my experience to help others, and hopefully they don't make the same mistakes that I'd made. I was going to be accountable. I was going to do what I said I was going to do. Now, I knew this would be important in order to get my sons back into my life. It was first couple of weeks. It was tough. The adjusting to the way on the outside world, getting around without a license. I had a DUI back in Iowa that I completely forgot about. Starting the process of getting my kids back into my life was daunting, and I was met with obstacle after obstacle, but God had a plan. Third night out of prison, which was a Friday, and I was at the Federal Halfway House, which I was staying at. They had a sign-up sheet for an event they were going to. When I asked someone what it was, They told me it was a recovery event, and I knew I had to go. That night was a catalyst for me standing before you tonight. I met two men that have become very influential in my recovery and a great support to me. I got to hear a message that night about strength and hope. I'm very blessed that around this time, I also started a great job with one of my best friends down here that I got sober with in 2007. It's probably one of the easiest sales jobs in South Florida, and I'm happy that I still have that job today. Now, I only get to leave at the time to attend AA meetings on a regular basis, which I went with one of my old sponsees from back in the day that I took through the steps and was still sober to this day and now giving it back to me. Now, after 2 months, they let me transfer to home confinement on an ankle monitor. Now, I knew I needed a church at the time, but the home confinement people wouldn't allow me to attend, and it was a lot harder than it should have been. See, a lot of guys before me had messed that blessing up. But luckily, after them denying a couple of requests, I asked if they would let me attend the church where they took me that Friday night for the night of freedom. It was approved. That Sunday, I was apprehensive to say the least. I was walking into a new place, and with all things, a big old ankle monitor on my leg. But God showed up. That morning, they were introducing a brand new intern pastor. I was like, oh my God, I remember briefly meeting that guy at the night of freedom, and he seemed pretty cool. Now, looking back, this is one of the times where I know God was looking down on me, smiling. After the service, I gained all the courage in the world to walk up to this new pastor and be open and honest with him. I word vomited all over him. I can't even remember what I said to him, but he just looked at me and smiled and said, hello, my name's Curtis, and you're in the right place. Let me tell you about myself. I found out that we shared some similar experiences and had literally been in my shoes not that long ago. I loved everything about him immediately. I knew God had placed him in my life that I needed to latch on, and that's exactly what I did. I asked him what I should do. He encouraged me to continue coming to church on Sundays, that I was welcome. He asked me to come out to CR in Loxahatchee on Monday nights. He told me about the food distribution on Saturdays. He got me in contact with Pastor Troy, and I began serving on Friday Night of Freedom. Then he became my sponsor. Then he did something that truly surprised me at the time when he asked me to make coffee and be up front every Sunday. I was like, Curtis, are you sure? What about this ankle monitor? Won't it be weird for everyone to see that as soon as they walk into the door? And he told me that he had been praying for someone exactly like me, and that I was the perfect example of what he wanted them to see when they walked through the door. I had found a home. About this same time, God blesses me with one of the most beautiful and wonderful blessings yet. And of all places, Facebook dating. Or as my son Mason seems to call it, Facebook Marketplace. What I found was not what I was looking for. It was way more, because I truly believe I didn't deserve it. I met a smoking hot blonde who was way out of my league. She seemed too good to be true, but I knew if I wanted it to work, I would have to stay true to my word and tell her the truth. I let her know about my past and my current circumstances. I told her about living at my mom's house, being on home confinement. Told her about my faith and how God had changed my life and how I was doing my best to live in his image, and she accepted it. She embraced it. For the first couple of months, our dates were Sunday mornings at church. Then they were Saturday mornings at the food drive. This eventually led to her attending CR with me on Monday nights and her starting her own program of recovery for herself. She says the initial first couple of months of our relationship, being so unorthodox, allowed her the opportunity to build trust in me and then the man I was becoming. I think it allowed God to build a foundation of Christ, a partner to serve the Lord with. Still, one of the biggest hang-ups I had was the strained relationship I had with my two boys in Iowa. So what God did was give me the opportunity to be a father to Zach, Josie, and Mason. Today, I do my best to be a positive example to them and to love their mama with all my heart. I'm grateful that they call me Dad today. Now, God's currently still working on the relationship with my boys in Iowa. It's not where I want it to be, but I know he has his hands all over it. May 11th of this year, the same church where we dated and served together, I got to marry the love of my life. I got to serve communion to our families. It was one of the coolest things I've ever done. I've been truly blessed with a life beyond my wildest dreams since I got out. That's not to say it's been all rainbows and butterflies, but life still shows up. Life on life terms can be tricky, but today I have tools. Now I have a network of support to rely on. Now I have God. Today I have the choice on how I handle those situations. Through the steps, my wife, my sponsor, my network of support, and my relationship with Christ, I know I can turn any mess into a message. Now, 2 weeks after getting married, we learned the news of the West Palm Beach campus closing. My sponsor and his family moving to Kentucky. To top it off, some goober named Trevor was taking over CR. I was devastated. I hate change. If anything I learned in prison, it was a good routine. I thrive on a routine. But something amazing happened amidst this change. Soon after it happened, I was sitting down with Curtis on my soapbox, complaining about how unfair this all was, how I just found a church home. I'd found a place to worship with my family. I had a group of people who accepted and loved me. He stopped me right in my tracks, and he spoke. He told me that everything you're saying is true, Chris, but what you found was more than that. You found that God loves you, God accepts you, and that he always has. They are just people, and this is just a place. Today, me and my wife get to bounce around from campus to campus, figuring out what God has in store for us next. I'm excited for our next chapter. I want to close with my favorite step, my favorite prayer. It's called the 11th step prayer, also known as the prayer of St. Francis. Now, I don't always get this right, but it's something I strive for on a daily basis. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, I may bring love. That where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness. That where there is discord, I may bring harmony. Where there is error, I may bring truth. That where there is doubt, I may bring faith. Where there is despair, I may bring love. Where there is shadows, I may bring light. That there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds, and it is by forgiving that one is forgiven, and it is by dying that one awakens into eternal life. Amen. Thank you for letting me share, guys.